I also read that apparently if you go out and buy a brand new combine harvester, now it doesn't come with a key at all.
I just shut up.
I'm back. Welcome to Bad Voltage, Season 2, Episode 64. My name is Jeremy. After a one show hiatus to let, I guess we're calling him Kubernetes Lothario, I learned earlier today. George Castro, thanks for stepping in. You did an excellent job trying to wrangle these two, which, as you know, is no easy task. But I'm once again joined by Stuart Langridge and Jono Bacon. What are we going to talk about today?
Well, I think we should talk about the Microsoft carbon negative pledge thing. You know, they've made a big statement about wanting to become much more environmentally responsible than they already are, and setting a really good example for the broader industry. So we're going to get into that. What else?
And I want to talk about digital quarantining and the coronavirus and a whole bunch of, at best, tangentially related topics, it turns out.
At best. And on that note, and now, Bad Voltage.
So I saw an interesting thing on source of all my news, depressingly, Twitter, the other day, which is that there's a whole other segment about whether this should be the case, but we'll get into that another day. This is someone saying that it appears that folks who fled Wuhan, which is currently the source of the coronavirus, those people have been digitally quarantined, likely via.
What does that mean?
Well, an awful lot of business and commerce in China is done digitally and is done via one of a couple of platforms, WeChat mostly.
WeChat's massive over there.
Yeah, and so. Reputedly, what has happened is that people who are resident in Wuhan and have gone outside Wuhan in defiance of the quarantine that's in place have had their access to WeChat and so on cut off. Which means that it's not like it is here where you go, oh no, they've cut off my access to PayPal, which means that I can't buy shit off of eBay at 2:30 in the morning when I'm drunk, right? If you don't have access to WeChat, then you can't check into hotels, you can't buy petrol. There's a load of complicated stuff
That's actually
which happens.
A good point to underline for people who are a little bit less familiar with China is he's not over egging the pudding when he talks about WeChat here.
Right,
like literally, it's freaking everywhere, and everybody uses it. So
for everything. So
that's like cutting off access to electricity.
But also to be clear here, to my understanding, and we should clarify a little bit, this is pretty late breaking and was released right before we went to record. So there might be some facts available when you listen to this that were not necessarily available to us when we recorded it. But it looks like the quarantine, to be clear, is that those apps don't work if you as a person physically went outside of the quarantine zone, correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding. But whether, yes, it is not clear how much of this is true. There's quite a lot of hearsay and so on going on here. But I don't really want to talk about that specifically. I want to talk about it conceptually, even if it hasn't happened. So, in this,
the notion of a digital quarantine.
I think that's why it's an interesting thing, because obviously in this specific case, Wuhan is a city in crisis. The healthcare system is going to have a difficult time dealing with something on this scale. And because of that, free movement suddenly has very real repercussions, and there's externalities that aren't normally the case. Now, that said, this is something that is so rife for abuse if it was to be adopted more broadly, that it's like every conversation that we've ever had on the show about surveillance, about centralization, about deplatforming, it's all those conversations on steroids, right? And with a physical component in a way that is a little scary.
Totally. I mean, for a lot of the discussions that we've had in the past, they've been, what if a system was brought in which allowed this kind of thing? But China is currently already beyond that stage. They already have this, even if people are not currently being quarantined for leaving Wuhan via WeChat. Right. It's entirely possible that they could be next week, whether it's for what might be construed as a good reason, which is that you're breaking quarantine, or for a bad reason, like you oppose the government. These things are in place. So what I want to talk about is, what do we think? Because the naive sort of techno-libertarian or whatever point of view is, this is a terrible, awful, dreadful thing to do, and no one should have their access cut off, and it's terrible that state power can do this sort of thing, and blah, blah, blah.
That was going to be my predicted reaction for you.
Well, actually, no. I genuinely don't know how I feel about this, because for thousands of years, people have known if you get plague in a place, what you do is you stop people walking to other places and spreading it. Right?
So just to make sure that I'm clear on this, so imagine I'm in Wuhan and I've maybe I'm infected, maybe I'm not infected. It's besides the point at this point. I've got full access to WeChat, and then if I step outside essentially a geofence border of Wuhan, then it stops working. Is that correct?
That's how it's currently being reported, correct?
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
Whether that's actually the case or not, I'm not sure. But spot me for a moment that is the case, or conceive of a hypothetical situation in which that is the case.
Yeah.
And tell me what you think about it.
What do you think, Jeremy?
So I think I agree with Stuart in this one, in that I don't know that I've had enough time to think it through, because there's a lot of different repercussions and moving pieces here. So, I mean, obviously the gut reaction for a lot of people is going to be, hey, if this stops the spread of the next plague and the next major pandemic and it ends up saving millions of lives, make sure people don't go anywhere, and by any means necessary. The issue I have with that conceptually, I'm like a sustainable frameworks kind of guy in how I think about things, and sometimes the solution at the time creates the next problem, and that there's a very real chance that in this case I think that's potentially an issue. I guess I would have to think through to give you a better answer how I really balance those two things, because this is kind of unprecedented.
So when you say that, Jeremy, you're talking about like maybe the solution now could actually be the source of a problem further down the line. Are you talking about this from a broader kind of, privacy rights perspective, or do you mean within the context of this whole coronavirus thing?
No, coronavirus aside, I think a state actor, China or not China, once they have power like this, they are not going to cede this power. This is a genie that once out of the box is never going back. And that has very real ramifications, both politically, economically, from how they're repressing opinions and viewpoints that they don't like, and how they use this could be really, really dangerous to I suspect there's some minority groups in China that see this being abused in a way that we haven't even thought of yet already, even with the pandemic not stopped yet, let alone if it stops it or not.
Yeah.
But if it stops it, that precedent will be a precedent that will be difficult to argue with in a way that is a little bit scary from a privacy and free rights perspective.
Well, I'm putting all the privacy rights stuff to one side for a moment. What I'd be interested to know is whether this technique and this approach will actually work. Like if you are going to leave that area and suddenly digitally you don't have access to WeChat, I'm sure that you can still have access to the phone network and to other things. Because I imagine that people primarily in a moment like that are looking for access to their family and their friends, and B, access to healthcare resources, right? So I'm just curious about whether that as a strategy even works.
So my gut is, in a society so predicated on digital connectiveness and on so very few centralized apps, that if you knew you were going to lose access to those things, precisely because it would mean losing access to your family, I think it would be a deterrent to leave for a lot of folks. For everyone, no. For enough folks to stop a pandemic, I guess we might find out.
Yeah.
It's a good point.
Exactly the thing. I mean, think about it from attempting to rewrite the story into our perspective, right? I've got a bunch of ways of paying for things, whether contactless or Google Pay or whatever, but they all actually end up in the one bank account. And even if I had 2 or 3 bank accounts, right? Imagine they were cut off. How far do I get? Right? If I decide, if they decide to quarantine Birmingham, well, they decide to quarantine the rest of the world to keep all of you out of glorious Birmingham.
By the way, this notion of quarantining Birmingham is a great idea.
Well, they could quarantine.
Oh,
I couldn't not take a swipe.
Well, it's got to be the thing. They can quarantine
the swipe
Bay
almost
Area
took itself on that one.
Exactly, We'll quarantine the Bay Area and then you'll all die of Parma ham poisoning. But
the Bay Area is already quarantined. It's just like you can't live here unless you're
a millionaire.
Unless you're a stupid amount of money. Unfortunately,
that's actually an alarmingly similar scenario to the one we're describing.
It is incredibly disturbing.
But Big Sam, I mean, imagine I decided to bail out of the city, go on the run to avoid being put under house arrest to keep the control of the disease. Right?
Go on the walk.
How far am I going to get without access? Go on the scooter, maybe. How far am I going to get without access to money? And the answer,
especially in a largely cashless society.
Yeah,
which China is.
And realistically, even if I could do things with cash, but right at the moment I haven't got very much cash in my pocket. And if you cut off access to my bank accounts, I can't get any either. I mean, how much cash have you got in your pocket right now?
No, don't ask me. We had this conversation 2 years ago about whether we carry cash or not. I am still very much of a granddad nation of carrying. I still carry around shekels in my pocket. So,
I think
the big question to me though is to what extent are you digitally cut off? Because if it's even in China, if it's like a big platform like WeChat, I agree with you. But I think as we've seen with technology, people find ways around it. To me, if you're cut off from things like phone networks, like any means of communication, I mean, obviously it's to both of your guys' point, like this is much more of an issue it would be much more of an issue in China than it would be somewhere else, like because there's a prevalence of other platforms in places like the US and the UK, whereas WeChat is so central over there. Well, but I'm just curious to what extent they've been cut off.
Bear with me here. I appreciate that in China you can't just walk into a Walmart and buy a burner phone to ring your family, but cutting you off from the phone network is hard because you can just find another phone and make phone calls on it. But you've only got one WeChat account, right?
Do you?
Well, I'm assuming that if you've got 2, they've got to have money in them, right? It's not like you can create a new WeChat account and then start spending.
I've got a WeChat account with no money in it.
Well, yeah, exactly. But then that's the point. If they cut off that account, you couldn't use it.
I mean, the point is, I mean, if you basically everywhere you go, you're scanning, QR codes of WeChat.
But I mean, I think we're kind of focusing on WeChat's an implementation detail of the discussion to me. Technically, it would be possible to allow you to, on a cell phone, to not use it if it was outside of a geolocated area. Like that's technically possible today. So if they're doing it with specific apps now, in the future, it seems like it could easily built in. And the interesting discussion is if it were, what would the ramifications be? At least to me.
Yeah. So it's that, I mean, the word Jeremy used, which I think is important, is balance. How much do we need it now? Answer, possibly loads. Pandemics are really bad. But how much are we giving people a weapon we're not going to be able to take off them? And this applies to things like when we've seen people bring in anti-terrorism laws, which have then been used for other purposes later. And removing various bits of people's rights because of things like terrorism crackdowns, which have then come back to bite us later. And this seems like a similar kind of thing. I completely agree with you, Jeremy, that it doesn't seem like the sort of thing we ought to put in people's hands because the potential for misuse is huge. Well, but it would be pretty hard to stand there and look someone in the face whose family is dying of coronavirus and say, I think it's really important that we don't do this because of privacy, right?
I think we forget how bad pandemics could be because we've gone a statistically aberrant amount of time without a true, real, a horrific pandemic. I mean, you go back to the Spanish flu in 1918.
Oh, 1918, sorry, yeah.
In between 40 and 80 million people died in a day where a Model T Ford was cutting edge transportation. So if something like that were to hit in the day of airplanes being so ubiquitous, who knows how many people would die, but it's going to be, monumental and horrific.
Yeah.
I agree with you, and I'm not downplaying the risk of a pandemic because of course, it's eminently possible. But the other thing as well is comparing those eras. I was reading into coronavirus as one such example that it's the death rate is significantly less than MERS or SARS, which is a good thing, obviously. And a lot of the people who are getting sick are people with compromised immune systems and the elderly and things like that. And I think one element of I forget where I was reading this, some website was basically saying, like, one of the biggest things you can do to prevent infection is just washing your hands. And I think one thing where probably the risk of a pandemic is always going to be there, but it's probably a bit less. While we do have an increased level of air travel, so we're way more connected and the global spread's probably a lot easier. I think also, by and large, world health is, from what I understand, on a global level, just increasing, like in terms of access to healthcare, access to sanitation and things like that. So we probably, the Spanish flu is a good example. Like, it was incredibly destructive in a fairly localized region. And it wouldn't surprise me if the risk of a pandemic today is going to be kind of what we're seeing now, where you're getting relatively small groups of in proportion of people dying, but scattered across the world because people are flying, right? And people are traveling all over the place. So it's just a different type of risk, I think. Years ago, I think you could say, oh, well, there's Ebola happening in this region. I don't have to worry about it because I'm in Birmingham. But now it's like, well, it takes one person to get in a plane and boom, off you go, right?
Which has been the nightmare disease spread scenario from epidemiologists for years and years and years and years. I mean, and we've had pandemics actually declared as pandemics various times since
2009, I think, was the last one. It's the last one I remember.
Swine flu was officially declared a pandemic. I think bird flu wasn't.
I thought bird flu was.
No, it wasn't. And the reason I know this is because I saw it on Only Connect. So I'm not sure that counts. But
what? Only Connect?
No, a TV quiz show here in the UK. Don't worry about it.
Oh.
It's really good.
Okay.
But anyway.
Yeah, it was swine flu. Somewhere in between 10 and 20 million people were infected. Somewhere in between 100 and 400,000 deaths. So it's the 0.03% of fatality rate for
mind blowing, isn't it? It's nuts. Different type. I mean, it is fascinating when you look at like just the way the modern world, the way something like a pandemic manifests differently in different eras. It's really interesting because on one hand, like we just said, on one hand you have the increased risk of exposure because of broader levels of air travel. On the other hand, you do have increasing general health spreading around the world. But then on the other hand, there are large parts of the world where people are becoming more affluent and they're able to travel more. It's just like a really interesting mix of variables. Hopefully we won't get anything near that level of pandemic moving forward.
Bringing the train back into the station that we were originally discussing, I don't think really you gave your opinion of, you asked Dak and you asked me, so what do you think about general geofencing as used in this case?
I'm always on the fence with this. I think we all are, but I just think that in not just with this, but with we've had the same conversation with different subjects for the last 20 years, right?
Yes.
We talked about the role of snooping by governments as a means to fight terrorism, as you mentioned, Dak. And my view is, I think you need to make sure that you provide societies with the tools to be able to react in situations like this. So in terms of as we all, I think we'll all agree, dealing with this instance of coronavirus in Wuhan, this to me makes a lot of sense, right? And I think they're probably making the right choice in doing so. I also share your concerns about the risk of these kinds of systems at a broader level. And it's not just driven by governments, but it's, look at what happened with advertising, the Cambridge Analytica thing, the risk of social media, and all these different pieces just of us having these large-scale systems. But I do think you need to make sure that you do have the tools to be able to address these kinds of situations, because much as I fully support the privacy nerds in all of this stuff, sometimes at the end of the day, you got to take a blunt force hammer to solve a problem, and sometimes that's going to compromise some individual, privacy and safety and all the rest of it. The thing I don't know is how do you increase the how do you lower the risk of that being abused? So we're talking about this thing in China, for example, and the Chinese government have got a long track record of snooping on their citizens and controlling the media. But in the US, it's a very different, in the UK, a very different world in that regard. And I don't know what you can do to...
So you're not in the liberty lost is seldom regained camp, I take it.
Right. I mean, I don't know. I've this similar views, but not the same with various things. It's like a good example of this is people. I don't want to take us off track, but in America, the word socialism, as we all know, has got a very negative slant. And my view of that is that the capitalist market doesn't work to serve certain things. Right? It's just not good for healthcare. Right? As an example, you need more socialized systems to deal with those kinds of things. It just doesn't work with capitalism.
Not good at,
and I think
collective action generally, which is the discussion we were having last week.
I think George. And this should be clear by the definition of what it is. Not good at things that don't have clear demand and supply curves, and that's one thing that has neither.
Yeah,
right. And I think the tricky thing here is, so in that system, like much as I think to a reasonable extent, for example, the capitalist system tends to work in many areas. I mean, it generates a lot of wealth for people. People can live the American, English, whatever dream that you choose. There are many flaws with it. And I think you need to have remedies in place to deal with flaws in systems. So to me, this is a good example of, digital freedom and all the rest of it. But sometimes you're going to have something like this as a remedy to deal with something such as a pandemic or a disease outbreak or something.
I have so many opinions about the economic portion that you brought into this, but I'm going to comment on.
We're not going to get sidetracked.
I was going to say it's not even a different segment; it's a whole different show. So, So this is one of those ones. A, because it is late breaking, but B, it's really nuanced and a pretty deep topic. I'm curious what the bad voltage community thinks about this. I think there's a lot to unpack here, a lot to discuss. So I think it's a good thing to move to the fore and potentially to have some additional conversation around this, especially once it's broke. By the time we post the show, it'll be another 36 hours will have happened, and in that time, I'm sure some information will have come out, and we'll know a little bit more detail wise that we could further discuss. So.
Yeah, and the other thing that I'd like the bad voltage community to feed into is not just in terms of this specific instance of the coronavirus in Wuhan, and this is a big question, but I think we all accept that these systems exist in the world today, for good or bad. What do you think needs to happen to prevent misuse by governments? I'd love to get the bad voltages community's thoughts on what practically could people do, and maybe the answer to that question is nothing.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'd just be curious,
misuse by governments, large corporations, so on and so forth. I mean,
right.
Uber are currently temporarily suspending the accounts of drivers and passengers if authorities warn they're infected or at risk of spreading coronavirus in Australia. So,
really,
whether that counts as corporate use of this kind of tool, or whether it's the authorities' use of this kind of tool being enacted via a corporation, or what, I don't know. But I certainly imagine that there are probably a whole bunch of people within about 15 miles of you, Jono, for whom having their Uber account cut off would be the end of the world. But so
it's true. Yeah.
So
I
tell
think
us what
if
you
their
think.
If their Lululemon account was cut off, I think that would probably have more troubling ramifications for the Bay Area.
Oof.
Lululemon. It is comfortable activewear, to be fair. A few weeks ago, an interesting story hit the news about Microsoft's carbon negative pledge. Did you guys see this?
Yes, in fact.
It's quite interesting. So let me recap this for our beautiful audience. So Microsoft has basically pledged to remove, quote, all of the carbon from the environment that it's emitted since the company was founded in 1975. Now, the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, said that he wants to achieve this goal by 2050, which is obviously 30 years from now. He said that to do this, the company is going to become carbon negative by 2030, which is in 10 years from now, removing more carbon from the environment than it emits, right? And then he wants to go beyond a pledge by its cloud computing rival Amazon, and they're basically setting out to go carbon neutral by 2040. So I just thought this was interesting because Microsoft obviously are a huge company. They've got many employees, and their impact on the planet is going to be noticeable, not just in terms of the offices that they've got up and running, but air travel, car travel, all of these different pieces. And the big question in my mind is, can they do it? What do you think?
What worried me about this, when I first read about it, it said, pledge to remove all the carbon they've emitted since the company was founded. And I thought, okay, so what they're going to do is they're going to get a box with 200 billion pencils in it and then fire it into the sun and then go, we're done. Fortunately, that's not the plan. But, this can't be a bad thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a little bit of background on this. So our old neighbors, when we used to live in our previous house, both work in the clean tech world, right? And they're both ultra nerds when it comes to this. And we were actually having dinner at their house the week after this news broke. And one of the things that they were saying is that apparently extracting carbon, so removing it from the environment, is just incredibly inefficient to do. It's just very, very difficult to do. It requires enormous amounts of power to do so. And then the big question is, where do you put the carbon? And right now, apparently, it's just basically buried in the ground is the best way to deal with it. So they said that the notion of removing, like, it's one thing to reduce your carbon footprint, which makes a lot of sense. And that's more tractable because you're making rules for moving forward. But they said removing carbon is just a very, very difficult thing. And to go back, for the last God knows how many years.
Yeah, I mean, reducing your carbon footprint, no one ever talks about reducing the carbon footprint to naught, let alone below naught, which is by definition impossible. So you've got to do a whole bunch of other stuff. I mean, I didn't know about half of the stuff you can do to actually withdraw carbon from the outside, things like carbon sequestration and so on. I knew about things like building new forests and so on.
That was one of the more interesting parts of the research for me, was that aspect, actually.
Yeah.
That's what they said as well. They said the best way to reduce it is to just plant trees.
Yeah.
And they're the most efficient way of dealing with it, and they require no power.
Yeah, you've seen the, I forget exactly what it's called, a whole bunch of YouTubers got together and did a thing called Team Trees, where they were essentially sponsoring or fundraising for a project which was going to plant a shed load of trees. And
nice.
This seems like a good idea. I mean, I'm slightly worried about a forest owned by Microsoft.
So many jokes.
I will allow you to fill in all of the jokes yourselves, but you can imagine the jokes, right?
Bad Voltage community, we look to you to make jokes about the Microsoft forest. Please share them on the forum.
Yeah, hashtag Microsoft Forest on Twitter.
There we go. Yeah, the other thing as well that our old neighbours, the resident experts, were saying was that one of the biggest contributors to a carbon footprint for large companies is just power consumption in offices. Like, a lot of offices leave the lights on. They leave their power, like they have a ton of computers that are already powered up. They leave the heat on. We see this all the time when you drive down any high street or financial district. All the buildings are lit up, and they said, part of this should be shutting that down. The other thing that they said that is a big contributor is just air travel. Air travel apparently is one of the biggest the biggest kind of gremlins when it comes to your carbon footprint. And the tricky thing with a lot of business is that people just, frankly, they refuse to travel. Or they can't get there in another means. Like you get the Paul Sladens and the John Masters of the world, you take a train across the country to get there. But a lot of people are just going to get on a plane, right?
Yep.
And what's interesting to me about this is what are the societal and, frankly, the leadership changes that need to happen? Because when we were having the conversation, one of the things that I was positing was that you got to set a good example. You got to have executives in a company like Microsoft say, I'm not going to travel. Because I think a lot of people, as they go up in their career, travel is seen as a bit of a badge of honor. Oh, yeah, I'm always on the road. I'm always traveling. I'm always at this conference and that conference. And you need to set the expectation of saying, no, I'm not going to travel.
Yeah.
Also, it's a badge of honor only to those who have not traveled.
Or those people who don't like being at home.
I don't know. I mean, yes, for all that I hear a bunch of people, the three of us on this podcast included, going, wow, I've spent so long on the road, it's so annoying. None of us are stopping.
No.
You know?
I don't know about you. I don't think I ever hit, well, Jeremy, I never hear you complain about travel. I hear you complain once a year about travel, which is when you come to the California.
Man, because California's
to
so
be
far
fair,
away.
just how my personality is, when's the last time you heard me complain about a thing? Insert anything.
He has a point.
Before we started recording, you complained about the last show that you weren't on.
Oh, I have some comments there. I'll save it for the outro.
You're not really a complainer.
But yeah,
so I think bringing it back to this, I think that one of the things that were interesting to me, because I went into the announcement thinking, this is just going to be another corporate announcement where they're announcing this broad initiative and it's kind of pie in the sky-ish. It had quite a few details. I was surprised at the amount of details in there and the kind of the wording and the tonality, and it was very much not just we're going to do this thing. It was aspirational in the way that, we're going to take a principle approach that's grounded in science and math, and we're taking responsibility for the ills of the past. And like the way that it was worded was not what you would typically expect out of a PR from a company, especially a company the size and age of Microsoft. So I thought that specific part was interesting. I think,
as far as I can tell, it's not greenwashing. They're not just looking to sprinkle the magic environmentalism woofle dust on top of their PR story and then not do anything. I mean, it remains to be seen whether they actually go through with this, but they seem to be saying the right things at least.
Is that a term, greenwashing? I've not heard that before.
Yeah.
That's just basically talking environmental bollocks for it's virtue signaling environmentally.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Gotcha.
But I think part of it in thinking about the reasons, and one of the big reasons is you look at Microsoft as a tech company. Really, there's no tech companies. We're all recruiting companies. If you're in the tech space, you are in fact a recruiting company, because if you recruit the best people, they make the best products, you make the most money, etc. And it's so difficult to recruit in tech right now. And it's clear that people coming out of college now care about the companies they work for's values being aligned with their own, in a way that I don't remember a previous generation doing, right? Like when most of us came out of university or college or whatever it's called in the country you grew up in, you worried about getting a good job that you liked. And I think today that's not necessarily the case. People very much care that their employer is aligned and a lot of different virtues, depending on your personal matrix, that are aligned with your own. And I think people care about this in a way that they might not work for a company like Microsoft if they didn't do this. And it's going to be huge for recruiting, I think.
I agree with you. I agree with you that in fact, I did some research on this recently. There was a research study done. Now, this was back in 2018 by dynamicsignal.com. And they were talking that 48% of millennial respondents in a survey of 10,500 believe that corporations behave ethically, and that's down from 65%. And the other thing that manifested in this study was that millennials in particular, when they look at the priorities for joining a company, not necessarily environmental, but kind of ethical, an ethical focus is increasingly growing.
Yeah,
so I think you're completely right about that.
To be clear, not millennials.
Well, that was the study. The study that was millennials.
Okay. The bear in mind that the youngest millennials now are like 24. But I completely agree with the point. I think it's interesting that I wonder whether some of that is because there's now the possibility of going to work for a company who shares some of your values. You know, I mean, when we came out of university, you got to say, okay, which one of these big companies will I work for in order to put another penny on the fucking dividend? And if I didn't want to do that, then my option was go and work for a charity or something. The idea that you could work for a big corporation which had some kind of virtue to signal was minimal at best. But as people are starting to ask for this more and the seesaw's starting to tip, as Jeremy says, companies are starting to think, well, maybe we should do this, even if it's rooted in the bottom line rather than it being genuinely the right thing to do. Doesn't matter. That's how change happens, right?
Yeah, and I think the other angle to this as well is, I think a lot of people, kind of to Jeremy's point, read this news from Microsoft and felt the cynical monster kind of rise up in their gut.
Rolled their eyes a bit, yeah.
But I think the thing that supports the validity of this is that, one, I don't think, certainly the three of us and many other people have got a bad word to say about Satya Nadella. That guy is kicking ass at Microsoft, and they're doing some amazing work. He's really turned that company around significantly. So I think if they're going to make that kind of intention, I trust Satya Nadella actually means that. I don't believe that they would put the stamp of approval on it. Now, if there are other companies that shall go unnamed that made a similar statement, I would be a much less believing, because I think the track record is standing there. But the other thing as well is, yes, it's an ambitious goal to remove all the carbon from the atmosphere by 2050, particularly with today's technology. But you know what? If you don't set big goals, you don't get there, right? I mean, that's the whole point of like OKRs, for example. When people are managing projects, is to be overly ambitious because you'll get further along than being less ambitious. And the good thing about Microsoft is they invest millions and millions of dollars in technologies and startups and funds and all kinds of stuff that will probably go towards building the technology that solves the problem. So I don't know. I'm inclined to basically believe that this makes a lot of sense, and live and let live. And it also sets the example for other companies, because if Microsoft are doing it, you know that there's going to be other similar companies or larger companies that are going to step up and make similar claims. And then that's how things change.
That's what I think makes the difference here. It's not that a big company is doing it. Obviously, that's valuable in and of itself, but not that valuable. What's important is that it starts a movement where people essentially compete on, they're doing this, Microsoft did it, we should do it too, because, and then it drags the whole industry a bit in that direction. It moves the Overton window to the point where you can say to your company who aren't doing it, hey, we should do this, and not just have a bunch of executives go, shut up, you tree hugger, but go, oh, blimey, we look like we're being left behind here.
Yes.
And therefore we should follow the crowd. If you're one of these companies who enshrines as a corporate value not the first but first to be second, be first to be second on this.
What do you think is causing this? Because, do you think it's just general societal movement towards better environmental responsibility? Do you think it was, obviously, the whole Greta Thunberg thing really shone the light on this, on again, environmental sustainability significantly? What do you guys think about what's generating this? Because this is a big step forward for Microsoft, right, to make that commitment.
I think they are looking for places that they can lead. And this is one of them. It's likely to be popular with people who think it's a good idea. It's not likely to be that unpopular with people who think it isn't a good idea.
I think we're finally at a point that sentence is correct, and that's a newish thing.
That is relatively new, yes. But the seesaw has, I think, tipped far enough in that direction. And this is something where they can take a stand and say, we are leading the tech industry on this. And any sentence which involves the words Microsoft and the phrase leading the tech industry is one that they haven't seen very much of in the last 10 years and would quite like to see again.
Yes.
They have in cloud.
Yeah, really?
No.
They're killing it with Azure.
Yeah. We asked 100 people on the street what the cloud computing provider was, and of the ones who understood the question, all of them said Amazon and EC2.
Yes.
Amazon and AWS.
Do not agree with you.
Then,
do not agree. This is a separate discussion, but Microsoft, especially I would say in the last 3 to 4 years, the amount of growth in Azure is mind-blowing.
Yeah, when you're growing from comparatively such a small base, growth is easier to come by.
Sure, but could you guys have ever predicted back in the early days of the cloud that Google will be lagging behind like it is today? A Microsoft.
GCP is interesting to me, yes.
Microsoft will be ahead. And you know who's leading the charge? A bookseller.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we live in bizarre. Anything's possible. Kids, stay in school.
We live in weird times.
I'm just looking forward to the Cadbury's cloud that's going to spring up.
There already is a cloud over Bourneville. It's just got rain in it rather than computers.
Yes. So it sounds like generally this is a relatively uncontroversial topic. We all think that, this good work, Microsoft.
I was going to say,
fill your boots.
I mean, I think I'd be surprised if anyone who wasn't some kind of utter rapacious bastard would say it was a bad idea. I expected there'd be more disagreement about whether it was all just lies. And I mean, much as the me of 15 years ago would probably be horrified by me unquestioningly buying a thing that a Microsoft executive has said about how they're going to do good in the future but haven't done any yet, I buy it. Sorry, me of 15 years ago, you were a moron and too shouty. This is actually a good idea.
You are a moron and too shouty. That is amazing.
And I guess like I say, I think a lot of it's because their track record is increasingly getting better and better.
And they've also committed to some very specific deliverables. So there's the $1 billion Climate Innovation Fund or whatever they're calling it. They're going to add the annual environmental sustainability report to their financials. So there's enough things that very easily will be apparent if they don't follow through on, that I think they've committed in a way that will make it painfully, abundantly in the near term obvious if they don't follow through. So when a corporation tends to do something, like you said, Jono, Satya's name being on it, A, but B, just how they've structured it, you have to think they're committed to it.
Yeah, I mean,
it's very thoughtful.
By definition, if Satya's involved in a thing, Microsoft as a company think that that's the most important thing that's happening in the world at the moment. That's what having the CEO involved means.
Yes.
The other thing which occurred to me is, fine, Gates does not work for Microsoft and has not for some considerable time. But equally, you'd think if you were putting together a fund of money to do good things in the world, and Bill Gates used to run your company, you'd at least pick up the phone and give him a ring and go, "Hey, Bill, we've got an idea. How do we go about this?"
He was almost certainly deeply involved in this.
You would think
certainly. Well, he's on the board, right? So that's one piece. And then the second piece is, I don't know how authentic this view is, but someone who I know who works at Microsoft in a relatively senior position says that Bill Gates to this day is incredibly involved in Microsoft, especially when it comes to their philanthropic efforts.
This is someone who works for Microsoft proper.
Yeah,
but so you're not married
I'm not
to this person.
This is Erica. No, this is not Erica.
She works for Microsoft.
To be fair, I was also suspicious.
I'm like, are you married to this person that you've had this discussion with? But no, okay.
It is no one from GitHub.
So I think one interesting question here, there are still a lot of holdovers from the old EEE Microsoft days, or whatever you want to call that era of Microsoft. What do you think the response from those folks will be? Will it be like, I'm satisfied that a company I don't like is doing a good thing for the wrong reason? Or do you think they'll write it off completely? Do you think this will change minds?
Do you mean the people who were part of the EEE thing, or the people who didn't like Microsoft because of the EEE thing?
The people that in 2020 still do not. So Jono's clearly changed his view organizationally. He believes in Satya. He believes that obviously, while it's a large ship to turn, the ship is turning, and they are genuinely a new Microsoft. There are many people who have not subscribed to that theory.
Right. So
what do you think? I just as a kind of exercise, what do you think those people will this change some of those minds, or will it? No.
If you go to people who still put a $ in the middle of the word Microsoft and say
Right.
they're doing this,
Don't say their name. Don't say their names, otherwise your Twitter feed will be haunted for the next 2 or 3 weeks, mate.
but having spoken to some of those people, we've talked in the past. We've had Steve Wally on the show in the past, and we gave him, we asked him a whole bunch of questions on this specific point. Yeah, Microsoft are changing, but is it sustainable? Is it going to keep going? Is it going to change if Satcher quits tomorrow? All this kind of thing. And people are in general not very convinced, but you do get the impression that this is one more brick in the wall, or one more brick out of the wall, depending on how you look at it.
Sure.
I think as this stuff continues to pile up, Microsoft is less a hated enemy than it was. I don't think a whole bunch of people who put the $ in Microsoft are ever going to start going, you know what, they're my favourite company on earth. Sure. But there's less of the sheer teeth-gritted, furious vitriol than there used to be, because if you have a discussion about this with someone and they bring up the Halloween documents now, you know that they're not really engaging with the problem as it currently stands, right?
That's a blast from the past.
And I guess we should clarify for those of you not steeped in Microsoft history. EE is there was a mentality that they had, which they would embrace something and then extend that thing, and then extinguish that thing. That's what EEE we're referring to, just so everyone understands what we're talking about.
The thing is, as well, as I think there's some of the people who are that kind of like gnashingly aggressive towards Microsoft. I'm a big believer that reasonable people should be able to have reasonable disagreements. And I think this show actually is a good example of that. Like, the three of us bicker and debate about all manner of different things, and we've had long held views that we've disagreed, with forever, but there's always a respect and a sense of friendship behind those discussions, right?
Yes.
And the kind of people who are just like, you know what, whether it's Microsoft or whether it's Linux or whether it's something else, they're just, nope, it's just outright, they can never put a foot right, irrespective of any evidence that's presented. I'm just not interested in their opinions. Like, you're not a reasonable person. And it's not just Microsoft, it's any opinion. It's like, oh, all liberals are ridiculous, or all conservatives are ridiculous, whatever it might be, or, anyone who uses a Lenovo, or anyone who uses a Mac, or anybody who, eats chicken, whatever it might be. Reasonable people should be able to have reasonable, I think, discussions. So I'm sure some of those people will never, ever see any good in Microsoft. And it's like, sure, but you're irrelevant to me.
I wonder whether there are more companies to hate now. So if you are determined to hate big companies in the world, now you've got to at least dedicate some of your tech hatred towards, like, Facebook or whatever. Whereas
so there's the same amount of vitriol, it's just distributed differently.
Yeah, it's like a Galton board or something, back in 1998, Microsoft hatred was the only game in town because no one else was around to be hated. What were you supposed to do? Hate Apple when they sold their 3 computers a year? It was, maybe some of them are still busy hating digital.
Oh, you know what we should do? We should do a show which is a trip down memory lane of the most interesting hate fests in the open source world.
Vitriol of times past.
I'll tell you what we should actually do is, I've literally just thought of this, we should pretend that we're doing the show exactly 20 years ago. So we do the same research in the news and everything about, that we do normally, and topics that are in the news or coming up or occupying the tech minds of the day. It's just for a week in 2000 rather than 2020, and then do a show.
That new version of BlackBerry OS, RIM is going to kill it. I can't wait to see where they are 20 years from now.
Look at all these people claiming they did all this work for the Millennium Bug, but actually they got someone else to do it. Man, that'd be cool. We should do that.
I wonder if we can get Dahl McBride as a guest on the show. Remember him?
If we can, we're doing it.
He was not liked.
He was, that is putting it mildly. He was, in fact,
definitely
not liked.
There was a lot of people who did not like Darl McBride.
Okay, Internet. If you think our 20 years ago show is a good idea, tell us, and we might do that, because I think that'd be quite cool, actually.
If nothing else, the three of us will have a laugh.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I on a related note, so when I live in Walnut Creek, right?
This is where the narrator's voice goes, it was not related. But carry on.
So I found out that so years ago when I started out in Linux and open source, right? We used to buy CDs in England from the Linux Emporium. Remember him?
Yep.
John Winters. And they would come from Walnut Creek. No, John Pinner was the Python guy. John Winters ran the Linux Emporium.
Really?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Because John Pinner died a few years ago.
He did.
Now, which was sad. Oh, John Winters was the Linux Emporium, was he? Okay, I apologise.
Yep. John Winters, yep.
Stand corrected.
And also, on a related note, Lars Kurth sadly passed away. May he rest in peace. He was a good guy. Anyway, so Walnut Creek CD-ROM, and I've been living in Walnut Creek for years. I thought, I wonder where where it was based in Walnut Creek, and I looked it up, and lo and behold, it was like a 2-minute walk from where I used to live.
Really?
It was the place where Walnut Creek CD-ROM was. Yeah, I drove over there and looked meaningfully at this, like a shoe shine place.
Oh, it's not Elevate or something. That'd be cool.
No, that would be cool. Yeah, Mr. Lucky's.
Wow.
Oh, I go to Mr. Lucky's, and the guy goes, pours you like a million shots of Jägermeister and gives you a Slackware 1.0 CD-ROM.
Yeah, so anyway, a little bit of a trip down memory lane. I like the idea of that, though.
The latest Walnut Creek theme bar idea.
It's like a hipster speakeasy. You have to pick between FreeBSD and Slackware when you walk in. It's
wow. Right.
What's the password? xfconfig86.
xf86 config. I feel like we have strayed somewhat off the subject of climate change and Microsoft. So
we may have done. Yes. We have a show.
We do. Okay, so we're done. And thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Jeremy, for coming back.
So
we like George, but we prefer you.
I very much do like George, and I apologize for putting you through that, George. And I had to miss. I listened to the show, so I haven't missed a show, and then listened to the show in a while. So I was traveling today, and on the plane, I listened to season 2, episode 63.
Well, thank you, George, for making Jeremy listen to the show.
And so we now have at least one listener, which is great. But on a more serious note, I remember being at your house maybe a year ago, and the lovely Mrs. Bacon, we were having a conversation about how she sometimes listens to the show and it enrages her because of what you two are saying. And I very much felt a party to that on the way. There were so many things I wanted to add and yet could not, because I would have just been the shouty guy in the plane in that case. But needless to say, I have opinions. Maybe I'll put them in the forum or something.
Yeah, that's what it's there for.
But it was an experience to be a fly on the wall.
When we say Bad Voltage community, could you go and share your thoughts in the forums? We mean you specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll be honest with you, it was nice to be able to finally have a thoroughly uninformed conversation without you dragging us down with facts.
On the other hand, I'm quite looking forward to Jeremy's robust defence of spending $125,000 on a tractor and then not being able to fix the motherfucker.
So I think that actually it's a super interesting topic, and oddly, I don't know if you...
Here it comes, audience!
So no, I obviously I'm on the other side of that, but the assertion that tractors have not material changed since the 70s is that, like, they drive themselves now. The sensors do things. So, like, now when it sprays water out, it takes into account wind speed and the humidity and the weather forecast and saves water and drives itself. So instead of doing 8 passes, maybe now you only have to do 7. So it saves, like, it does a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
You should just be able to have access to that because you own the thing.
I also read that apparently if you go out and buy a brand new combine harvester, now it doesn't come with a key at all.
Just shut up. I'll tell you what.
You should have access to this stuff.
I found out loads about the Wurzels from Wikipedia. After the last show, I actually went and looked them up. And they did loads of stuff. It's amazing.
I was also, I think I did laugh out loud at the point where you're like, this may not come as a surprise to you listeners, but I know nothing about farming. Oh, really? The guy that lives in Walnut Creek knows nothing about farming. The mind heals.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
man.
Well, it was a fun discussion. We did talk a lot about tractors. And I also did some research into the Wurzels as well. For those of you who are not familiar with what we're talking about, they released a song called I've Got a Brand New Combine Harvester and I'll Give You the Key. And that was their only discernible hit from what I can tell, but they actually put out a load of music. So.
Yeah, they did tons. I was genuinely
surprised. Have you seen the video
surprised.
for that song? The video for that song is...
I have not.
All of the 70 in one place.
It's intriguing. Yes, okay, so
It's intriguing.
I think we are done. Are either of you appearing anywhere, speaking anywhere in the next couple of weeks?
No.
I am not in the next 2 weeks, though, but we all are appearing something shortly after that delineation.
Yes, we are. March the 6th, Bad Voltage Live at Scale in Pasadena, California. So off you go to the Scale website and buy a ticket.
Yep. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. Going to be doing the usual what we do. We're going to put on a live show. There'll be some audience participation. So be sure to go to Scale, A, because it's brilliant, and B, go to Scale to join us at Bad Voltage Live.
Yeah, that's SoCalLinuxExpo.org.
Yes. Yep. Before we started recording today, we're throwing around some ideas, and I can't tell you what we have in store, but if you've seen a previous show, it will be equally as hilarious, if not slightly more hilarious.
Yeah. That's going to be the tagline for our show.
Equally
hilarious, if not slightly more hilarious. In fact, I'm going to put that on the posters at the venue.
We should
remember that.
We're bringing the old sound person back. It's going to be perfect.
Yeah, so we're not going to talk about that. All right, that's it. Thank you, everybody. Go and join us in the community on Slack or on the forum, and we'll see you next time.